Hello, good morning, and welcome. It is Monday, December the 1st, and Keir Starmer will today attempt to drown out criticism of the budget with a speech focusing us on what the point of it really was, following all of that Chancellor-splaining at the weekend on TV shows, denying that she'd effectively invented an economic black hole to justify raising taxes. But can Keir avoid it being called mansplaining? My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Behind the first Advent calendar window is a speech in central London by Keir Starmer, who will insist growth is back topping his government's agenda, but coming days after a budget that forecasts GDP downgrades in each future year until the end of the decade. And also this morning, Keir Starmer will suggest welfare reform is still a priority. Again, days after his budget saw him having to fork out £12 billion because welfare changes he didn't want to make were demanded by his party and he wasn't strong enough to resist.
The long tail of this budget will be evident elsewhere today too. A big day for the Office for Budget Responsibility. We could discover the fate of the man at its helm, Richard Hughes. Now, later on, the Treasury today will receive the first report into how a copy of the OBR's market-sensitive budget document appeared online 45 minutes before Rachel Reeves got up to speak last week. The Financial Conduct Authority investigation into whether there was market manipulation as a result of the leak is also underway. And if Hughes manages to get through today, well, he still faces a grilling by the Treasury Select Committee on what went wrong.
I was listening to Rachel Reeves on Trevor Phillips' programme on Sky yesterday, and when Trevor asked Rachel Reeves about Richard Hughes and the OBR, I actually thought she struck quite a kind of conciliatory, almost sort of sympathetic note. And I wondered whether that meant that Rachel Reeves was allow Richard Hughes to stay in his job. After some conversations, though, I'm now led to believe that she saw herself as more defending the institution than the man. So I think it's very much let's wait and see. There's so much else today besides the budget to talk about. For instance, on page 2 of the Times, it's emerged that only 153 migrants have been deported under our deal with France, hardly a deterrent. Now, some 13,856 landed in the UK since the treaty was signed on August the 6th. So it feels like that centerpiece of our migration policy just isn't working. So expect that to come up in the days to come.
And speaking of difficult relations with the country over the channel, one major thing that seems to have gone a bit below the radar, Sam, is the collapse of a key part of our reset talks with the EU. That's over defence. And it's the collapse of the plan called SAFE, which would have allowed UK companies to play a greater part in the EU's 130 billion defence loan schemes. Those talks broke down as we went into the weekend over a dispute about money and how much the UK would have had to pay into the pot in order to take part because we are outside the European Union. Now, this is particularly unpropitious timing, given that the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, is arriving for a state visit on Wednesday. That kicks off, received by the King, bells and whistles all around. Behind the scenes, I gather Germany was very keen to help the UK bring down that price of entry for joining the SAFE agreement. We've got big defence deals with Germany, but that ended up not being agreed to by the French, who still wanted the Brexit tax on UK entry into the scheme. So there's quite a lot of frustration, I think, there. And it's on the eve of that visit. The negotiations simply drew a blank, which would indicate that the wider reconnection is going to face some quite considerable hurdles.
I know it's a really busy day, but I really wanted to put this very high up the podcast because there's a huge warning siren that should be going off right now. Our talks with the EU more generally just do not sound like they're going that well. And it's such a big element of our foreign policy, or it's at least we're told that it's such a big element of our foreign policy. Look, by now, the Chancellor was suggesting back in the earlier in the autumn that we should have a youth mobility scheme. We don't. And when you look in the entrails of what went wrong with the defence deal, there are a couple of bigger factors, I'm told. Firstly, as you just say, it was just saying that not only were the French pushing on the size of the payment, but there is a broader debate about, with some member states about the extent of the monetary contribution the UK has to make in order to get access to various funds and all the rest of it. if we are to see any benefits from the reset overall. And apparently the Irish are quite grumpy about the kind of deal it's known as the SPS deal, phytosanitary deal. This is about reducing checks on agricultural food getting in that goes from the UK to the EU. They think that there's work to be done just simply implementing the Windsor framework and before you can get onto that. So that sounds like it's subject to a go slow as well. These are vital parts of our economic reset. And, it doesn't sound like we're going to see economic benefits from closer EU ties anytime soon.
No, I think that's right. Unless we get a pleasant surprise this week, it does look like lots of nice mood music and cultural ties kind of stuff around the German state visit. I think that there's going to be quite a focus on youth and reconnecting youth. But as you point out, unless we actually get somewhere that looks like a breakthrough, it might be all very pleasant, but not much content behind it. One other story over the weekend that caught my eye is our old friend, Keir Starmer's biographer, Tom Baldwin, claiming in The Observer that Morgan McSweeney, the powerful chief strategist / chief of staff, possibly still chief of everything or not, in Number 10, has been forced to give a vow that he'll never speak directly to journalists again. Apparently, the Prime Minister wants only the Number 10 communications team to speak to the likes of us. We are here, Tim. Call us.
I have to say, all of that drove quite a lot of traffic to my WhatsApps yesterday. As you say, let's see how it plays out in practice. Right. Let's get on with the budget, though. And where do you think we are now?
Seems to me, Sam, that the first job today is to stem the damage that's done by the row over whether or not Rachel Reeves exaggerated or even invented, according to her critics, the economic black hole in order to justify tax rises to pay for welfare spending and to increase her headroom. It can be Badenoch for the Tories keeping up the pressure. She'll repeat her calls for Keir Starmer to resign at a mid-morning event. She's going fully nuclear on that one. My Playbook colleagues pointing out that by coming out today with a speech which I think is effectively trying to explain the theory of the case behind the budget, he's entangling his fate very firmly with that of Reeves herself, and particularly backing her version of that dramatic breakfast time intervention that she made on November the 4th, which indicated that she thought the black hole was so bad she was going to have to raise income tax. Of course, that turned out not to be the case. And the question then goes to him, was he aware of the true nature of the OBR forecasts at the time? So to counteract that, I think we will have Starmer talking more about welfare, fleshing out that vision that was quite scanty in the budget, I thought. Alan Milburn's role will be re-announced, his commission to get more young people back to work. And I imagine that the Prime Minister will want to insert perhaps more of a sense of urgency in that. He'll also be casting this budget as part of a national renewal, insisting that Reeves is setting the right course for the country if only we can be patient, and talking up cost of living help on energy, on prescriptions, on rail fares, the bits of relief that the budget did offer, in the hope that all of this manages down inflation and persuades the Bank of England to reduce interest rates so that people will feel a little bit richer.
It's a funny one, that, because clearly getting down inflation, getting down interest rates is now the foundation of this government's claim to growth and where that's going to come from. But when you look at the budget last week, there are other bits that absolutely kind of count against that. You've got rising wage pressures caused by the increase in the minimum wage. I mean, if that's going up, it's hardly a surprise that the OBR has inflation going up in the next 2 years compared to its last forecast. So there's a bit of push me pull you that it doesn't look terribly consistent. And as for growth, well, that was something that took a backseat in the budget. So, Keir Starmer puts that centre ground again today. But all there is an announcement from the PM that Business Secretary Peter Kyle will provide monthly updates on the implementation of the industrial strategy. Calm my beating heart, Anne. Is that enough? And and where are we left with the central attack on the budget?
I was just about to say that sounds absolutely fascinating. It's the sort of things I used to cover in Moscow, the implementation of the industrial strategy. Let's deal with the being a bit mean. It's only Monday morning. Let's deal now with the main line of attack over the weekend, whether Starmer and Reeves did mislead the country and indeed the cabinet by claiming that there was a hole in the public finances big enough to justify tax rises, and then that a dramatic improvement in the forecast had allowed them the wriggle room to abandon that. Well, we've got one cabinet minister reported in the Times as saying that the cabinet were kept out of the loop and that the handling of the budget has not been straightforward. This story has dominated the last few days. Now, Sam, you did a lot of reporting around that time when the black hole was being presented to us as something that absolutely had to be taken seriously and would drive the budget. What do you make of it now?
Quite a sort of nuanced view. I want to start by playing you this. It's a bit of the interview that I did with Rachel Reeves next to the M25, if you remember that, on October the 13th. And in this saga, dates really do matter. So this was the first time Rachel Reeves had confirmed publicly to anyone that there was a black hole in the economy that meant there were going to have to be tax rises and that we were in something of a doom loop. And look at what she put all of it down to.
The aim here is long-term growth, and one of the things that could set that back is the huge black hole that we're facing, possibly the need for tax rises. I read at the weekend that this government's putting the blame for that at the door of Brexit. Is that something that you agree with?
So the Office of Budget Responsibility, who provide the independent forecasts for government, they have consistently overestimated our productivity performance.
Because of Brexit?
So look, it'll be up to them to set that out, but austerity, Brexit, and the ongoing impact of Liz Truss's mini budget, all of those things have weighed heavily on the UK economy.
Okay, so that interview was 10 days after she'd been told by the OBR about the economic challenge she was facing. And in that, it showed that the economic deterioration was in the order of £12 billion. Okay, so that's big, right? But she just gave you three reasons, austerity, Brexit, and the Liz Truss mini budget. But that was only ever one part of why she needed to raise money. So £12 billion economic deterioration, 12 billion for welfare U-turns, which she chose not to mention in that interview, and 12 billion more for headroom, which in fairness, she did give a nod to, even if she didn't go to quite all the details. So that was kind of only a partial account of what was going on. And what's really interesting and what's exercising people, one of the things that's exercising people is that from that point, the forecasts got better through the back end of October, but the rhetoric got worse. And it was only after the improved forecast, and here's the critical bit, that she was at her most doom-laden, the now notorious breakfast press conference in early November, where she signalled to the country that she might have to break the manifesto. So that is one of the big lines of attack, that the facts that she was receiving and what she was telling people didn't quite match. How significant is that, do you think?
Well, listening to that clip again, Sam, I had actually forgotten how strong the wording was in your roadside conversation with Rachel Reeves and her tone, that sort of urgency. And this is why there is such a lot of consternation about the way the budget was subsequently put together and the underlying argument. It was clear that the size of the black hole and the decisions that were going to be forced by it. Now, that's very different from ending up in a budget in a position where the OBR can justifiably say, no, you did have this information earlier that you had more headroom than the worst predictions, and you went ahead and you spent an extra 3 billion just now on the benefits bill, talking to the Labour heart perhaps rather than the economic head. And it just feels symptomatic of a journey without a clear kind of destination, a give and take of accountancy measures, but without an underlying narrative that can explain this switch. So it'd be really interesting to see how Keir Starmer goes about it without digging deeper. As I think someone said in the playbook this morning, it was like, if you're in a black hole, when do you stop digging?
Absolutely. I think There is a bit of nuance in this, though, because reading some of the criticism over the weekend, I could see critics sometimes deliberately conflating the economic black hole with this other black hole, which is the amount of money Rachel Reeves felt she had to raise in total, because there was the economic black hole plus the welfare black hole plus the need for additional headroom, right? And there's no doubt in my mind, as we talked about earlier, that Rachel Reeves only gave a partial account of the challenge, but it's worth saying this before people get too carried away, to be fair to them. So the first thing it's worth saying is that there was a productivity downgrade. That was real. It cost the government £16 billion in the budget. And, notwithstanding the improved tax take that ameliorated some of it, they would have been £16 billion better off in this forecast if that hadn't happened. Now, as it happened, the OBR did it at a favourable time, but that was real. And you can't let that get lost. Another thing is that, they didn't actually say what they were going to do in public. And they did raise taxes on working people, which some people think broke the manifesto. And they did need to pitch roll. And so, everybody talks about what they thought that breakfast press conference signalled. But, in the end, Rachel Reeves didn't publicly lie to the country from the podium in Downing Street. And, and there's one third thing, Anne, and this is sort of almost like a clarion call about why you should listen to this podcast. The whole row over this weekend has been about how we didn't know that there was slightly better economic news that meant that the productivity downgrade didn't in the end have such a bad effect. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper, unless you were listening to us. At the end of October, we were saying, having been guided by the brilliant Resolution Foundation, who come out of this budget pretty well, I think. At the end of October, I was reporting that the economic downgrade would only amount to about £10 billion, which was just £4 billion off the eventual figure. So if you were paying attention, you knew that the productivity downgrade wasn't as bad as they were saying. And it was just a matter of choice whether or not you thought that this Chancellor's partial account of the economic backstory was particularly more egregious than any previous Chancellor's kind of story that they spun up in the run up to a budget. They all sort of test credibility a little bit. So, but here is one thing, Anne, where I think they are in trouble. If I had to hone in on one issue, and it's to do with how they behaved the moment that they decided to signal they were no longer doing the income tax rise, right? The day after, and we had all of that market turbulence and the cost of borrowing kind of flailed all over the place, we were told that they decided to ditch the income tax rise because of improved economic forecasts. But there had been no improved economic numbers in over 2 weeks. So even at the point on November the 2nd, where she did the odd Downing Street breakfast press conference warning how grim things were going to get, she already had the numbers showing things were better, and they didn't improve any at all since then. And that, I am told by people in the markets, is where they feel that there is some actual dishonesty. Where do you think that leaves her, Anne?
I think it leaves one big problem, which is just about this relationship between Rachel Reeves, the Treasury, and the OBR, frankly, because the odd thing is, as you point out, and you've taken us quickly through that timeline, the OBR might have its own problems over that pratfall of the leak. But more fundamentally, it is forcefully reminding the Treasury and reminding the public that its forecast hadn't really evolved at the time. Its forecast had always been there. If everyone had chosen to bookmark it and just stick it to the top of everything that they wrote and reported, it was there all along in that period. So something else changed. And it's always a bit difficult when you can't really explain away a change. I think that is perhaps where the government and communications have got into a mess on this. Some people might respond to this conversation we're having, and a lot of the media focus on this. Look, this is a budget that affects real people, real household finances, real businesses. Never mind all this to and fro with the OBR. So I thought it would be worth reflecting a more positive voice that I heard at the weekend. Now, this is a big figure in finance who invests on behalf of a very well-known major business family in the UK. And I was rather expecting gloomy features, because most people sitting around dinner tables at the weekend were having a good moan about something in the budget. He took the view it didn't do any further harm to the UK in terms of the wealth creators, global wealth, people coming into the UK, investing here, the investability, if you like, of Britain. Said, there's no further damage to non-doms and the like. Rachel Reeves didn't raise taxes on banks. That talk of the wealth tax and exit taxes was off the table, and that he thought inflation would come down. We could be looking at 2% inflation within a reasonable amount of time. That was always what Rishi Sunak wanted, if you remember as well. It didn't quite happen for him in time for the election. That Rachel Reeves might get luckier, that productivity might be bottoming in the cycle, and things, if you like, could only get better. So I wondered if you had to maybe be in the top 0.1% to feel so chipper. But it is, I think, true, and we haven't seen so much about in the papers at the weekend, the very wealthy and the people who were worried that it was going to be another, if you like, raid on the multimillionaires, are feeling okay, and think that Reeves has signalled to that extent that the UK is open to capital and open to business.
So no revolt from Anne's wealth creators or others. No revolt either from MPs. I did a bit of a survey last night. There's no Labour MP backlash over this, it has to be said. But there will be a revolt, Anne, if we keep talking, because we have bussed comprehensively over our 20-minute limit. So let's draw it to a close there. There's a lot going on, not least in the foreign affairs sphere. We'll have to get back to that tomorrow. But such a busy day and an important day on budget and domestic matters that I think we will wrap it up there. Have a brilliant day, and we will see you back tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.